Hi, my name is Lydia, and thank you for clicking on this video. If you are interested in true crime like I am, I invite you to come back to listen to more crime stories. I will be talking about the crimes of Mark Unger, who was charged in the death of his wife, Florence. An autumn weekend getaway with their 2 children at a fancy lake resort in the state of Michigan was meant to be a time for the family of 4 to relax and enjoy one another. But by the time the weekend was over, only 3 of the 4 family members would be leaving the lake alive. My sources for this true crime are linked in the description box below. In my telling of this case, I mean no disrespect to any of the persons mentioned. It is always my intention to relay this information for educational purposes and to give a voice to the voiceless. Florence Gabriel Stern was born on March 16, 1966, and as a young girl, she was adopted by parents Harold and Claire Stern. Harold was an ambitious and successful attorney. Claire took care of the couple's young children. Claire had had a traumatic childhood, surviving the Holocaust in Europe by being hidden in many closets. The family lived in an affluent neighborhood in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, primarily a Jewish neighborhood. Religious traditions were important to the Stern family, and they would be important to Florence in the years to come ahead with her family as well. Florence, nicknamed Flo, was a bubbly and popular teenager, a born flirt. Friends would say later that her flirtatious nature was born out of a need of reassurance and affection. Her friends would also say that in her late teens and early adulthood, Florence did not get along well with her parents. Flo attended the University of Michigan, where she was a fine arts major, and she enjoyed studying photography. She had an artistic eye, and she loved taking photos, especially of her children in later years. Florence was a natural beauty, and she was also described as being very charming and fun. She had a lot of friends who loved her. Her rabbi would say later that Flo had the ability to help people make connections with one another, as well as true friendships. Mark Stephen Unger was born November 29, 1960, in the same affluent area as Florence Stern. Mark and his family lived in the neighborhood called Huntington Woods, north of Detroit. His mother, Bet, owned a resort which included a bar and several restaurants in the Florida Keys. Mark attended an exclusive private school called Detroit Country Day School in Beverly Hills, another affluent area in the Detroit suburbs. He played on the football team, swam on the swim team, and also played tennis. Mark loved sports. Mark majored in communications at the University of Michigan, and in 1981, it was his 3rd year of college. As he was finishing his junior year, he felt he lacked the motivation to complete his last year at the university, so he left the school and bounced around for a while. First, he went to Tucson to the University of Arizona, where his sister Kim was enrolled. After 4 months there, Mark went to Los Angeles, where a friend had pulled some strings, getting him a job writing copy at an ad agency. Eventually, Mark went back to school and enrolled in local Pepperdine University in California. There, he also worked as a DJ on the student radio station, and he discovered his love of broadcasting. In 1982, when Mark was home in Michigan on a visit from California, he met Florence Stern for the first time through a mutual friend. Mark was 22 and Florence was 16. There was nothing romantic between them at the time, and Mark continued his traveling across the U.S. In May 1983, Mark headed from California back to the East Coast, to the Florida Keys to work for his mom, Bet, who owned a resort there. Mark was 23 years old, and waiting tables and tending bar, he enjoyed making money, eventually starting to manage one of the local restaurants called the Harbor Inn. A sportscaster from Miami would drive down to the Florida Keys to the Harbor Inn to do a sports show 1 hour a week. The show mainly was about talking deep-sea fishing with one of the local captains. Part of the deal was that someone from the restaurant of the Harbor Inn would get to advertise some free drink specials and other events going on at the restaurant. Mark Unger was the one who got to do this part of the job. Mark loved to be on air. And when football season came around, it was clear that the sportscaster from Miami didn't know much about football. So Mark would get to chime in with his football picks. Soon, Mark was getting more and more airtime. In 1984, Mark got a regular gig at a radio station in the Florida Keys, doing a 5-minute sports recap Monday through Friday. In March 1986, bored of living in the Florida Keys, although a beautiful location, it really is just one long road in and out, Mark returned to Michigan. He was 26 years old and he was interested in pursuing broadcasting in a bigger sports market. Mark landed a job at the popular Detroit jazz station WJZZ doing sportscasting there. He loved broadcasting the games of the local Detroit area professional sports teams, the same teams he loved growing up in Michigan. The Detroit Tigers baseball team, the Detroit Lions football team, the Red Wings hockey team, and the Pistons basketball team. In addition, Mark would also cover the University of Michigan football and basketball games. In 1987, Mark Unger ran into Florence Stern again through a mutual friend. Flo had certainly grown up, and Mark was interested in getting to know her now. Soon after that second meeting, they were going out on a first date. Mark was 27 years old, and Florence was 21. Their first date, Mark took Flo to a Detroit Red Wings hockey game, using special access granted by his press pass, of course. Dinner followed at a jazz club. And Flo was very impressed with Mark Unger, and they started to date regularly. In August of 1989, Mark Unger proposed to Flo Stern. They were married the following year on February 24, 1990, at a temple outside of Detroit, and they spent their honeymoon in Mexico. Mark continued his job at the local Detroit radio station, and he also got a job as a director of the local Jewish Sports Hall of Fame. Florence got a job at a jewelry store, and she also continued her hobby of photography. Flo became pregnant soon after she and Mark were married, giving birth to their first son named Max. Flo had always dreamed of being a stay-at-home mom, and finally her dreams were realized. 2 years later, Flo and Mark welcomed their second son, named Tyler. The family of 4 bought a house in Huntington Woods, north of Detroit. Although their actual financial situation didn't quite match the lifestyle that they wanted to live, they had both always grown up in the Huntington Woods area. It's where all their family and friends were, and that's where they wanted to live. Of course, purchasing a home in the very affluent area did not turn out to be a wise decision for the couple. Soon the couple was filling their home with purchases that they really couldn't actually afford, as well as expensive clothes and cars and everything that went along with their lifestyle in Huntington Woods. Flo was an antique lover, and she was often bringing home things that she had found at local antique stores that she just couldn't pass up because it was such a bargain. The couple also spent a lot of money recreationally, going out with friends and family to restaurants, sporting events, and eventually to a very fancy lake resort. The financial stresses on the family were beginning to increase, so Mark was forced to leave his job at the radio station to take a higher-paying job. Mark started to work for a friend who owned a local mortgage banking company called Worldwide Financial Services. Indeed, Mark was making the more money that his family needed, but it came with a lot of stress. The year was 1994, and the mortgage company began to offer subprime lending to its clients. To Mark, he knew that the company had dishonest business practices and that it was getting its clients into lending situations that they really couldn't afford. He knew that the company was taking advantage of home buyers with credit problems and pushing them into bad financial situations. Marriage and family life chugged along for Florence and Mark for 4 years. In 1998, Mark was prescribed an opioid for back pain from an old sports injury. Soon, he was addicted to the pain relievers. Not only had Mark become addicted to painkillers, he started gambling at the Detroit city's first casino. Quickly, Mark's addictions would also include gambling. As Mark started to spiral, the marriage broke down as well. Flo asked Mark to attend rehab, which he agreed to do. He always told his friends and family that he did it for Flo and not for himself, which really is the wrong thing to do. If you're going there, you need to go for yourself. After 5 months in rehab, Mark returned home. He really wanted to make his marriage work. He loved Flo so much. While Mark had begun his spiral of addiction and eventually landing in rehab, Flo had found herself having to get a job. Flo got a job as a mortgage banker at a separate company from where Mark had worked, a local mortgage banking company. Flo really hated her job though, and she really resented Mark for putting her in the position to having to work at a job outside of the home. When Mark returned from rehab, the couple still struggled in their marriage. Flo agreed to go to marriage counseling, although she had been unhappy in their marriage for a very long time. Flo told her close family and friends that she was considering a divorce. She told them that she no longer loved Mark. On August 26, 2003, Flo filed for divorce. She had decided to break the news to Mark at a marriage therapy session. Mark was shocked and upset. On September 15th, Mark Unger was served with divorce papers. Still very much in love with Flo and trying to get their marriage back on track, Mark implored his friends to help him talk Flo out of the divorce, calling his friends, begging and crying for them to help him win Flo back. A few of his friends became concerned and even frightened at Mark's erratic behavior. Mark was becoming unhinged. During this tumultuous time in their relationship, Flo may have been sending mixed signals to Mark as well. To calm him down, she had agreed to get together socially with him, although she claimed to her friends that they no longer had a romantic relationship. Mark and Flo still lived together. Later, her friends would say that Flo was just trying to keep the peace within her family. It was very important to her that her 2 kids, Max and Tyler, felt comfortable and safe in their family, even though their parents were getting a divorce. From Flo's perspective, she was just trying to be friendly and nice, but mutual friends knew that her attempts at being nice was just giving Mark hope, giving him the sense that they might indeed get back together. It was a false hope. Early in the month of October, the Ungers had made plans for a fall weekend getaway to the lake resort called Watervale in northern Michigan. The family had been going to Watervale every summer for years, and they talked about their planned weekend with friends. Privately, Flo had told her friends that she didn't really want to go on the trip at all, but she didn't want Mark to go alone with the kids. She asked her friends if they would consider coming along as well, but unfortunately they were unable to do so. Flo and Mark were just not on the same page when it came to their marriage and the beginnings of their divorce proceedings. Flo would constantly talk to her friends about the upcoming divorce and her unhappiness with Mark. Mark would talk to those same friends, telling them that he did not want his marriage to end, that he did not want the kids to go through a divorce, and that he could not see a way that he and Flo would be able to live separately and happily. Mark was just in complete denial as to what was happening with the divorce, his friends would later say. He did not want to accept it. On Tuesday, October 21st, Mark and Flo met with their divorce attorneys to start the divorce paperwork. The hearing had been called to make sure that financial information was properly being exchanged between the 2 parties, and also to work out child support and visitation issues. On the advice of her attorney, Flo had brought forth all of the information about Mark's addiction to gambling and painkillers and alcohol. Mark felt greatly betrayed. He had asked Flo not to bring that information to the divorce proceedings, but it was very likely that Flo's attorney had told her that she just did not have any choice. She had to protect herself financially in this divorce. It was only 3 days before Flo's death. On Wednesday, October 22nd, the day after the meeting with the divorce attorneys and 2 days before their planned trip to Watervale, the Ungers' neighbor Ron saw Flo outside of her house digging in her garden. He had called over to say hello. He asked how things were going, and in return, Flo had said that things were not going very well at her home, and Ron could tell that Flo had been crying. On the following day, Thursday, October 23rd, Flo met her friend Gary for lunch on a break from work. Gary was also a good friend of Mark's. Flo told Gary that she and Mark had been fighting on how to divide up their belongings. Flo also told Gary that she did not want to go on the trip to the Watervale Lake Resort. However, Flo told Gary that she thought it was very important for her two kids to see that she and Mark could get along, and that even though that they were going to be divorced, they could still be a family. Later that day, Flo talked to her older brother Peter on the phone. Previously, months earlier, Flo had admitted to Peter how much in debt she and Mark really were. Peter was aware of the very strained relationship between the couple, and he was surprised to hear of their planned trip to Watervale, and he offered that Flo would come to visit him instead while Mark would take the kids alone to the resort. Flo said no. On Friday morning, the morning of their planned trip, Flo talked to her friend Susan over the phone. Flo told her friend about the divorce proceeding earlier in the week and how much she and Mark had been fighting. Susan was very surprised to hear that their planned trip to Watervale was still going to happen and that they planned to leave later on that day. Why, she had asked Flo, why are you going? And Flo had said in return, I made a promise to my kids to go and I'm going to keep it. I just want to go up there and relax and chill. The Inn of Watervale was located on the south end of Lower Herring Lake, a small lake in northwest Michigan and close to the large lake, Lake Michigan. In 2003, the resort was co-owned by two family members. One part of the resort was owned and operated by Lynn Duncan and his wife Maggie. Their part was comprised of 8 buildings on 3.5 acres right on the lake and another 40 acres of undeveloped land. The other 25 cottages at Watervale Resort was owned by Maggie's cousin, Dory Turner. The weekend of October 24th, 2003 was crisp and beautiful, with the colorful fall foliage of the trees surrounding the lake. Not many guests would come to the resort in late October, but those who did would enjoy the bright oranges, yellows, and reds of the trees overhead and the very quiet atmosphere. Flo hoped it would be a peaceful and relaxing weekend. On Friday, October 24th, co-owner Lynn Duncan decided to tackle some end-of-season chores. One of those chores was to clear off the boathouse deck of furniture. The boathouse deck was a gathering place for the people who were staying on the resort. The deck was on top of the boathouse and looked out onto the lake. The flat boathouse roof was 12 feet above the wide concrete apron that lined the lake's breakwall. The water was shallow there, only 6 inches deep. Lynn took off all the chairs from the boathouse deck by himself except for one heavy chase lounge that he decided to leave there for the winter. He folded it down and decided to leave it in place. Lynn and his wife Maggie had already shut down the cottages that they managed for the winter season, so when the Unger family arrived, they needed to stay in one of the cottages that was managed by Maggie's cousin, Dory Turner. All the cottages had names, and the cottage that the Unger family would stay in was called the Mary Ellen. The Ungers had arrived on mid-afternoon of Friday, and Dory Turner had enjoyed watching the kids play with their dog in the yard with Mark as well. It was around 4 p.m. Later, the Unger family would go to a restaurant in town for dinner called Dingy's. At 8 p.m., a witness named Fred, who rented one of Lynn Duncan's cabins over the winter season, walked by the boathouse and noticed that a couple was up there. He was walking to his boat, so he introduced himself. It was dark, but Fred had a flashlight with him. He had also noted that there was a candle balanced on the deck railing overlooking the lakeside. Fred and the couple shook hands and introduced themselves. He learned that they were Flo and Mark Unger, and while they were talking, that candle blew out from the strong wind. Fred said to the couple that he had to go, pointing to his boat. "Are you sailing over to Camp Lookout?" Flo had asked. and Fred affirmed that that was his plan. To Fred, Flo had said in return, "Oh, I could never do that. I'm afraid of the dark." Among friends and family, Florence Unger's fear of the dark was well known. Flo would often ask friends and family to escort her home if it was nighttime and she had been spending the evening at their house. She was fearful of walking alone at night, and if she knew that she was going home alone to an empty and dark house, she would always make sure to have someone on the phone with her when she entered the house. She was just afraid of the dark. Flo's father would later say on the witness stand at Mark's trial, his daughter Flo had always been afraid of the dark, even at a very young age. By the time Fred had sailed across the water, got into his cabin, turned on the TV, it was after 9 p.m. It had already begun to rain. At 9:15 p.m., Dory Turner looked out from her own cottage out toward the lake. It was pitch black outside and it was misting rain. The little light that was always left on at the boathouse had burned out. Everything was dark. Nearby, Maggie and Lynn Duncan were in their own cottage as well. At 9:30 p.m., Maggie had gone to bed to read, while Lynn stayed up to watch TV. At 10 p.m., Dory took her dog out for a walk. It was raining. She noticed that there was a light on in the Mary Ellen cottage. At 11:30 p.m., after watching the news, Lynn Duncan got into bed next to his wife, Maggie. All was quiet in the dark night outside. But all was not peaceful. At 7:30 a.m. the next morning, on Saturday, October 25, 2003, Lynn Duncan was awakened by a phone call. It was Mark calling to report that his wife was missing. He was crying and he was asking the Duncans to go look for Flo. Dressing quickly, Maggie and Lynn got out and they walked down to the boathouse. Lynn noted that the one chase lounge that he had left on the deck was now in a different position from the day before. Previously, it had been laying flat as Lynn had left it, and now it was sitting with the back propped up. When the Duncans climbed to the boathouse roof, walked across the deck, got to the railing looking over the lake, they looked down. There they saw the body of a woman floating face down in the water. It was Florence Unger, and she was deceased. Florence Unger was only 37 years old. Maggie returned to the house to dial 911 while Lynn Duncan went down to examine the body in the water. He noticed that next to Flo there was a wet quilt laying on the flat concrete strip which butted up against the lake break wall, called the apron. In addition, there were 2 burnt-out candle stubs and some broken glass as well. Lynn then walked up to the Mary Ellen cottage to give Mark the news of what he had found. He told Mark that Flo was in the water. In response, Mark screamed, running directly to the boathouse, going around to the water, and climbing in. However, he did not touch the body of his wife. He did not attempt to roll her over or touch her at all. When the first responders arrived and determined that Flo was already deceased, they decided to not move the body in order to protect any crime scene. After meeting briefly with the emergency services personnel, Mark had returned to the Mary Ellen cottage. He had to tell his sons about their mother and also to start making some phone calls. According to the Watervale staff and other residents who were with Mark at the time, Mark would alternate between hysteria and calm composure, making phone calls and receiving them on his cell phone. One of the first calls that Mark made was to Flo's parents, Harold and Claire Stern. Upon receiving the news of their daughter's death, Harold and Claire immediately suspected Mark of foul play. They thought that somehow Mark was responsible. The thought that her death could have been an accident did not even enter their minds. Their next thoughts turned toward their grandchildren. They did not want Max and Tyler staying with Mark. It was decided that Max and Tyler would stay with Peter Stern, Flo's brother. Like his parents, Peter had immediately suspected something was fishy. As Mark continued to make phone calls home to family and friends, the news of Florence's death began to circulate quickly through the neighborhoods of Huntington Woods. Soon everyone would know that Florence Unger was dead and that her death was a true mystery. His phone calls complete, and now under the watchful eye of the local police who had arrived on the scene, Mark was becoming quickly agitated. He paced and muttered to himself that he had to leave and he had to get his boys out of there. While Flo's body remained in the water as the police were carefully examining the scene, Mark was already packing up the car to leave. However, the police would not yet let Mark leave. Police examining the scene would note that the wooden boathouse railing was only about 2 feet tall, not much of a barrier. They also noted that one of the support pillars on the railing was fractured and splintered, splintering out towards the water. Yet it had not broken through. They noted missing paint chips from the railing, with some scattered paint chips on the deck as well as on the concrete apron below. Lynn Duncan would report that damage to the railing had not been there on Friday when he was removing all the furniture from the boathouse deck. Police went to the Mary Ellen cottage to interview Mark, but his answers were very evasive. They were simple and direct, but they did not give much information at all. Mark reported to the police that he just simply could not remember any specific details about the night before. Police then interviewed both Max and Tyler. They reported that their parents had gone out to the boathouse while they had watched movies in the cottage. Their dad had returned alone, watched movies with them on their DVD players for a while, and then he had helped them to bed. He had told them that their mom would be back in a bit. Later, their dad had come home to kiss them goodnight again. He had told them that he had been listening to the Detroit Red Wings hockey game, and he told them what the score was. The boys went back to sleep. Mark was asked to write down his version of events for the police. This is what he wrote. We came up Friday night for the weekend. Went to dinner at Dingy's. Came back to Watervale. Watched DVD with kids. Walked to the deck. I came back to the cabin to get kids to bed. Went back to the deck. She wasn't there. Went back to the cabin. Fell asleep watching DVD. Got up in the middle of the night when Tyler called. Woke up this morning, no Flo. Called Lynn and Maggie. Lynn told me he found her. I ran down there. I tried to get her out, but blood started to come out. Started crying. And that was it. It was signed and dated with the time. The time was only 12:35 p.m. Because the note was sparse and lacked any details at all, the police questioned Mark for more information, but he would give them none. He appeared distracted and agitated, and he was ready to leave. When the police turned the conversation to the couple's impending divorce and his recent rehab stay, he had found this information out from the Duncans and other Watervale resort guests. Mark had cut the interview short, saying that he had to return to his sons and get them out of there. He wanted to bring his boys home, he said. The body of Florence Unger was finally lifted out of the water at 6:30 p.m. By that time, her loving husband Mark and their 2 sons were already on their way back to Huntington Woods to the nice home that she would never occupy again. The autopsy of Florence Unger would reveal much about her death. The contents of Flo's stomach determined that she had likely died within a couple hours of her last meal. It was also discovered that there was no water in her stomach, which indicated that Flo was not conscious when she entered the lake. However, she was likely unconscious. Further evidence to that fact was that blood vessels in her lungs were congested with water. That meant that Flo had been inhaling blood as it leaked into her nasal cavities. To the medical examiner, it had meant that Flo had been unconscious for some time before she had entered the water. Had she had gone right into the water after the fall, the medical examiner would later explain that she would have drowned before the blood would have gotten into her lungs at all. Looking over all aspects of the injury to Flo's body, the medical examiner would conclude that Florence Unger had died of craniocerebral trauma. Her death was caused by an acute injury to her head and her brain. Under Michigan law, the manner of death could be listed as one of the 5 possibilities: accident, suicide, natural, homicide, or indeterminate. The examiner wrote nothing at first. He had left it blank. He was waiting to do further tests on Florence's brain. He also planned to wait for more information from the investigation as to the scene of the crime and how the body had been found. The examiner's initial thought was that Flo had lain on the concrete apron for perhaps half an hour unconscious, and then somehow her body had gotten into the water. But he didn't see how that could have happened just on her own. So he simply wrote, "Pending investigation." Florence Unger's funeral was held one day after the autopsy had been completed on Tuesday, October 28, 2003. Later, the medical examiner and others linked to the case would argue as to whether Florence had died due to her brain trauma or due to drowning. Ultimately, the experts would agree that whether or not she had died due to drowning, the trauma to her brain incurred by the fall would have killed her just the same. In December 2003, the medical examiner had changed his initial note of pending investigation to homicide. The crime scene photos had swayed his opinion. He did not see how Florence's body would have gotten into the water after the traumatic brain injury that she had suffered upon her fall from the boathouse deck. He believed her body did not move on its own into the water. However, he would state later that he thought that those findings alone would not be enough to convict Mark Unger in the death of his wife. While the medical examiner was considering the autopsy findings, the investigation into Mark Unger was fully underway by the police detectives. But the investigation process was very tricky. Since Florence's death had occurred in a different county than where the Ungers made their home, yet their home county would be the county in which the investigators would have to interview family and friends as a possible motive, it made for a slow-moving legal process. The subject of custody of Mark and Florence's children, Max and Tyler, would telegraph to the public the intentions of the Oakland County's prosecutor's office. They would have to link Mark to his wife's death before his parental custody could be taken away. Investigation efforts had been taking place behind the scenes, however. Investigators were examining photos of the crime scene, including the blood stain on the concrete apron of the lake breakwall below the boathouse, which indicated where Florence must have lain for a period of time. And they were also investigating the boathouse itself, looking at the railing, taking angles and measurements and distances, which would detail how Florence's body could have fallen from the boathouse itself. Investigators also created various simulations of weight being applied to the railing and how much force and weight would have been needed for the railing to splinter and an object to fall. The investigation results stated that the railing would support a leaning body with no problem, and that it would only start to show signs of cracking and bending when a real display of force was applied to it. In the spring of 2004, the prosecutor's office believed they had enough evidence to arrest Mark Unger, and he was arrested on May 19th. He was charged with an open count of murder and released on bond, pending a preliminary examination on July 6th. Because of his arrest, Mark's custody proceedings were put on hold pending his trial. He agreed reluctantly to give up the custody of his 2 children, Max and Tyler, to Florence's brother, Peter Stern. He hoped it would just be until after the trial was over. During the prelim examination of Mark Unger, a huge bombshell was dropped by the prosecutor onto the court. Florence Unger had been having an affair prior to her death. Glenn Stark and his wife Kathy had lived in Huntington Woods and been good friends with Mark and Florence Unger. Glenn and Kathy had eventually moved to Montana in the year before Florence's death, but they had also been back to visit a few times, keeping in close touch with the Ungers and visiting them when they could. Investigators had discovered the affair after reading Florence's email correspondence with Glenn. They had questioned Glenn, and he had confirmed the affair. It had been going on, off and on, for 2 years prior to her death. On the stand, Glenn had been questioned as to when he and Florence had last been intimate. He stated that it had been during his most recent visit to Michigan when he had stayed with the Ungers. It had only been a week before Florence's death. However, the revelation of the affair was not quite enough for the trial to move forward. Prosecutors and defense wrangled on the medical evidence and the testimony of the medical experts, arguing as to whether Florence had died by drowning. Only a short time into the proceedings, the judge determined that the charge of first-degree murder was unsupportable and dismissed it. Instead, Mark was bound over on a charge of second-degree murder, and he was released on bond. By January 2006, almost 2 years later, additional medical evidence brought forth by the prosecution was enough for the judge. In total, the preliminary examination period had lasted 18 months. The charge was reinstated to first-degree murder, and Mark Unger's bond was revoked, and he was ordered to jail. His trial would begin in May 2006. But before the trial officially started, a plea deal conversation took place. Mark's defense attorney wanted to know if the prosecutor would be willing to consider a manslaughter plea. He said that his client might be willing to submit to that plea under the standard guidelines of only 19 to 38 months of prison time. The prosecutor stated that in order to consider any type of manslaughter plea, Mark would have to agree to at least a 10 to 15-year sentence. The defense attorney was adamant Mark Unger would never agree to that. So the first-degree murder trial began. It was a high-profile trial, and media crews from across the country was in Michigan to cover it, including Dateline. The points from the prosecution would include the following: the Ungers' strained marriage, the gambling and drug addictions that Mark had suffered from, the couple's constant bickering and fighting, Florence's desire for a divorce and Mark's unwillingness to grant that divorce, and the fact that Mark had been probably enraged when he might have found out about Florence's affair. The points from the defense side would include: 1. Florence's fall was caused by a decaying railing on the boathouse roof and a slippery deck due to rain and green algae. Also that the police had just jumped to conclusions and not investigated the scene properly. And that the medical experts were forcing a conclusion that a drowning death had occurred and that was not factually conclusive. And that Florence was not perfect herself because she had had an affair. An early highlight from the trial was that the jury was asked to take a trip to witness the scene of the crime firsthand, traveling as a group to the Watervale Resort on the Lower Herring Lake of Michigan. They were invited to go to the boathouse, walk up to the deck, walk around, and then also go inside the Mary Ellen cottage where the Ungers had stayed during their weekend trip. The jurors were likely surprised when they had arrived at the resort and saw how luxurious and expansive the resort really was. To hear the Watervale Resort described and to look at the pictures, it kind of reminds me of the resort from the movie Dirty Dancing. Crucial points made by the prosecution during the trial were the following. After he had discovered Florence's body in the water, Lynn Duncan had told Mark that Florence was in the water. Without telling him where she had been found and how, Mark had run directly to the spot where she was, walking right into the lake. Yet he had not tried to get her out of the water. Mark's odd behavior in that he had never asked the medical personnel as to what they thought had happened to Florence and if she could possibly be saved or anything could be done, and that he wanted to leave right away, even though his wife's body was still in the water, was noted. The findings of medical experts that both the blood stain on the concrete apron and the result of the autopsy pointed to their decision that Florence had lain on the flat surface of the concrete for a total of 30 minutes or so. And because of that length of time, it was their opinion that she had not moved of her own volition into the water. She had to have been moved into the water by someone or something else. It was the prosecutor and state's intention, and they believe the evidence supported it, that Florence had fallen from the boathouse deck, had lain there for some time, bleeding and unconscious, and then Mark had moved her body into the water. Crucial points made by the defense were the following. The boathouse deck railing was in a state of disrepair and decay, and the wooden supports had dry rot. If Florence's body had been moved from the concrete apron into the water, there was no proof that Mark was the one who had done it. It was even admitted by the medical examiner that something else might have possibly moved her into the water, even though it was a very small chance. The defense also brought witnesses to the stand that refuted the opinion that Florence was afraid of the dark, pointing to their own opinion of that and their own experience with her. The defense pointed out that Mark Unger still loved his wife and he would not have wanted to harm her. In fact, he was trying to stop the divorce and get back together with Flo. They said Mark was a family man and committed to his sons and his wife and wanting them to remain as a family unit. They said that Mark was already financially secure, being able to live off disability insurance. And it was the defense's contention, because they believed their evidence supported it, that Florence had fallen accidentally from the boathouse deck railing and that she had rolled herself into the water. Mark Unger was not called as a witness in his trial. He had decided not to testify. On Friday, June 16th at 10 a.m., the judge instructed the jury before they began their deliberations. The judge instructed the jury that Mark Unger was presumed innocent unless the prosecution had proven each element required beyond a reasonable doubt. As for reasonable doubt, the law was intentionally vague and circular, allowing each juror to decide what it meant for themselves. They were free, the judge said, to choose which witnesses to believe, and free to believe or disbelieve portions of a witness's testimony. They could decide for themselves if a witness had lied and to what extent. They had heard, the judge said, testimony from many police witnesses. Their testimony should not be held in any higher regard than that of other witnesses, he said. The defendant had been charged with first-degree murder. Those elements were that the death of Florence Unger was caused by the action of the defendant, that the defendant intended to kill her, that the act was thought out in advance, and that the killing was deliberate. The premeditation needed only to be long enough to give a reasonable person a chance to think twice about whether to proceed. The judge said the killing cannot be the result of a sudden impulse without thought or reflection, but premeditation could include as little time as 1 minute. The jury was also free to consider the charge of second-degree murder. That was particular to Michigan law. Second-degree murder required that Mark had intended to do great harm or created a very high chance that death or great harm would likely result from his actions. The judge instructed the jury to first consider the charge of first-degree murder. If they agreed that Mark Unger was guilty of that, there was no need to discuss the lesser charge. If, however, there was some disagreement, they could discuss second-degree murder. At 4:50 p.m. on Friday, with no word coming from the jury, the judge dismissed them for the weekend. They returned on Monday, and the day passed with no word from them. On Tuesday, the jury asked to have parts of the testimony read back to them. They were asking for medical testimony as to the difference between lividity and bruising, and when bruising would occur on a person. The information was read back. Lividity is the pooling of blood in the body that occurs after death. Bruising is considered a vital process, meaning that it happens during life or in the first few minutes after life ends. The jury also wanted to hear testimony regarding Mark Unger's packed car after his wife's death and his son Max's testimony regarding his recollection of the events of the night of her death. On Wednesday, the jury was ready with their verdict. It was June 2006, almost 3 years after the death of Florence Unger, and Mark Unger was convicted of first-degree murder. It was somewhat of a shock to both the prosecution and the defense. In an automatic appeal, Mark's appeal lawyers argued that his rights had been violated by an ineffective trial lawyer. In 2008, the Michigan Supreme Court declined to review Mark's case. The appeal then moved to the federal courts. And in 2018, 10 years later, federal appeals courts also ruled against Mark's appeal. The court rejected Mark's claim, saying evidence against Unger was overwhelming and that any failures by his lawyer was unlikely to affect the verdict. In February 2019, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed. Mark Unger's appeal was denied and his efforts to get a new trial were exhausted. Mark Unger is incarcerated at Chippewa Correctional Facility in Michigan. His prison details note that he will be there for life. Thank you for your time in watching this video. I know your time is valuable and I'm so glad you chose to spend it listening to this case. And if you want to share your thoughts about this case, please leave a comment below. I would love to discuss this case with you. And if you would like to hear more true crime stories, I do invite you to subscribe. It was my honor to tell you the story of the victim of this crime. May the memory of Florence Stern Unger be a blessing to all who knew and loved her. Until next time, everyone, please take care. Bye-bye.